Okay, actually, my T-shirt is "Which is a better starship captain, Picard or Kirk?" And the new TV show Picard um, debuted yesterday. I haven't seen it, but it's on my to-do list. Okay, so we want to talk about Medicare being sick care. This is something new. I haven't heard this argument before, and this is a really, really good argument that if we had to pay for our own health care, we would have an incentive to stay healthy. But because with Medicare, it's funded by either a government or in the United States, an HMO, Health Management Organization, um, people just take it for granted and they don't have an incentive to stay healthy. So, is this a realistic way of looking at it? From an economics point of view, yes. Although we are capturing a societal problem and we are boxing it in as simply a Medicare cost. Because if we went to a user pay for your own healthcare system, then what are we looking at? We are looking at the, someone wants to say, dregs of society. In other words, people who are not competent enough to get the economic argument. And we know, driving around in every city and town in the world, that there are some people who are not mentally competent. They don't have the mental capacity to understand this economics argument. Perhaps they were born that way. Perhaps they had a brain injury. Perhaps they have developed an addiction. And you would say, well, they should have had the, yes, but I mean, if you look at places where it is user pay, they still have these problems. So, it's existed in history that people had to pay their own way. And I know the argument was in the United States, does it have government? Well, it seems to be kind of a mixed system. I mean, some people do seem to fall through the cracks. But if you were to look at this, the way it is, our human societies do include people who don't have mental capacity to understand the economic argument. So, if you're going to say it's user pay, too bad for you if you don't have the mental capacity to understand the principles of this economics. We're just going to leave you on the street. Well, then you're creating more problems for society because you're going to have increased police cost. I guess you're going to have the police picking them up and putting them into where? Are you going to arrest them for vagrancy? I mean, this is human history. What do you do with people who don't conform to rational economics? Lock them up, put them on a work form, put them into the army, put them into an institution. I mean, this is what we used to have. We used to have huge psychiatric asylums for these people. Who paid for these? Well, it was still paid for by the local government. Some of these asylums might have been paid for by religious institutions, but they were there. So this is the problem with using a rational economics argument. You can convince a lot of people that are rational, but the people who don't have the mental capacity I don't know. Are you going to go to euthanasia like Adolf Hitler? That's what he did with his problem of people who were either physically or mentally disabled. He euthanized them. Do you want to go down that road? Um, the people of Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, they went with it, or they looked the other way and they pretended it wasn't happening. But I mean, that's an example of a society that said, "Okay, go ahead, there, Adolf, and your final solution, go with that." Um, what would you say to those German people? Those German people might have been saying, we're stretched. I can't afford the taxes I'm paying. My salary doesn't pay the rent. And this is the slippery slope you go down. And some people are going to be like up in arms and saying, you can't euthanize people because they don't have mental capacity or they're physically disabled. Anyway, that's human history. And if you want to go back to human history, well, it's always an option. Human history is also, if you study human history, you will see why countries like Canada went with Medicare. If you go to the Canadian Museum of Civilization and look up Medicare, it'll give you, it's not a really in-depth summary, but it basically says, with the Great Depression, people were dirt poor, and they were having a hard time. In those days, you paid your doctor with cash. So, and they didn't have the cash to pay the doctor. So there's, if they were working on farms, they would deliver, chickens and foodstuffs to the doctor to pay in barter. The key point is Great Depression. In other words, was the Great Depression caused by people who didn't have an economic incentive? No. The Great Depression was not caused by individual people. What caused the Great Depression? Well, these are the business cycles of capitalism. They're basically, if you look at it a long enough period of time, you'll see these business cycles of capitalism have been around all through recorded history. So it is normal in a capitalist society to have booms and busts. And so where does that leave the people? Well, where does it leave the people? It led the Canadian people to go with a government pay system. We haven't had a Great Depression like they had in the 1930s. So we don't really understand how brutal it can get. Are we headed for another Great Depression? I think we could be. Some commentators are talking about it now. The enormous um, garbage that's going on between, just for example, the US government and Wall Street after the enormous banks were bailed out by the US government. And since that time, the US, well, the Federal Reserve has poured trillions of dollars into the stock markets to keep them afloat. How much longer can this go on for? I don't know. Am I worried about it? No, I don't worry about things. If they happen, then I deal with them. But in a worst case scenario, you could be looking at. Well, let's talk about it. What are we looking at? We're looking at the removal of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency around the world. So, do you want me to talk about reserve currencies? I mean, if your currency is a reserve currency, that's a sweetheart deal for you. You print money out of your own banks in your own country, and other countries adopt your currency as being like gold. If other countries don't consider your currency worth holding, and that seems to be the way that many countries of the world are going, then your country that has got a printing press madly printing US dollar bills is going to see a reduced demand for it. And when things like oil stop being priced in US currency, um, well, I mean, you can always go to the money changers and change your dollars for rubles or won or something. But you lose the advantage of a reserve currency because, well, your currency becomes more and more worthless in the world market. So, what does that lead to? Well, hyperinflation. Very difficult to do a juggling act as a economist in a country like the United States that has corporate welfare for enormous banks of Wall Street, bails out the banks in a bad cycle, but then you hear those same bankers saying, no socialism for the people. It's okay for us, but not for the people. So, I mean, that's basically what you're looking at. The capitalists of Wall Street will demand social relief from the U.S. government, but they turn around and they said, not for the people. It's hypocrisy, and it's a sign of, well, I mean, if you're into economics, why is it? Why is it that the banks want socialism for themselves but not for the people? Greed. Primarily greed. And it's primarily a failure of the capitalist system. And it's also the enormous leverage that Wall Street has over the US politicians, that whatever they want, they get. How does this go back to Medicare and sick care and incentivizing yourself for staying healthy? Well, this is the problem with economics. If you take economics at school, it's very simple, They have a supply and demand graph, and all kinds of interesting ideas come from it. But, what's taught in the classroom versus the real world, they're not the same. In economics, they always say, all other things staying equal. The real world doesn't work that way. In the real world, everything is changing. All kinds of different things keep cropping up. So, is it a real science, economics? No, it's not a real science. There's some interesting mathematical things you can do in economics and in finance. Fascinating things. The Black-Scholes option pricing model and where they got it from is absolutely amazing. So it's not to say that some of these things aren't mathematically interesting, but is it a real science? I have to say no, because they always say all other things being equal. In our world, that doesn't happen. And then, if we're going back to sick care, I mean, some things that humans have as medical problems are beyond their control. If you have some kind of an accident and you become paralyzed, well, where was your incentive on that? Well, despite me buying an expensive car that had all the safety features, I was in a car accident and I still broke my neck. Or I inherited a genetic disease, Huntington's, for example. Or, just as I aged, I got Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Well, my economical friend said, well, you should have been putting money away. Well, or you should have bought private insurance for these things or something. Well, this was the whole argument for government Medicare, is that they looked at the private markets and they said, why don't we do it with the government instead of, and we'll remove the profit for the insurance company and it'll be more efficient for people to have the government do it. Well, the pros and cons, of course, are some people say, well, private sector is more efficient than government, and I have to agree for the most part. But the efficiencies in the private sector always go back to the private company and the shareholders. Governments could do a better job, but they're corrupt. They're corrupt because there's always these capitalists that get into government and they want to offload government services into the private sector because the private sector can do it and take the money and run. And so these things are always fixed. They're fixed to fail. They're fixed to fail all the time. Because the incentive, if you look at it, the incentive for a capitalist is make government fail. So these services will have to come to me, the capitalist, and I can make a lot of money on it. See, there's an incentive in there. So if you look at the right-wing politicians, it's because they're in bed with the capitalists. And it's all about more money for me and my private company. There's always incentives. So you're right to look at incentives. But you have to look at a really big picture instead of, keeping everything else equal. Because it ain't. And if it's you who bought your, what are you going to do? The examples are insurance companies in countries like the United States. If you have a pre-existing medical problem, sorry, we're not going to take you. You have to really understand. The private sector doesn't want pre-existing people with problems. They just want money. And they're very good at getting really smart accountants and actuaries to figure it out. They're really good. And they only want the cream of the crop. They want healthy people, young, healthy people. In the end, we have got what we've got. And, humans, previous generations have had these problems and, they kicked them on down the line to us. Do we want to keep it this way or what? For me, I am open to new ideas. I don't want to go back to old failed ideas.